Welcome back to the class video for Module 4, the first of two modules devoted to Rousseau's On Social Contract. In the first part of this module, we looked at Rousseau's historical context and a few of the major themes of 18th century European politics that helps distinguish Rousseau's historical context from Locke's. As we turn now to look at the text, it will be helpful to have a kind of outline of the organization of topics to help differentiate Rousseau's model of the social contract from Locke's. In Book 1, Rousseau will describe the social compact, and as we'll see, he's not so much interested in the dilemmas of the state of nature. He sort of presumes we're in a bad place and have to create a society, but he's primarily focused on the psychology of that contractual transaction. What happens to us internally when we give over our natural condition? How does that change us as human beings? And what is the nature of the relationship then between each individual and the collective, that umpire that Locke described, the community acting as umpire? What is the psychological relationship between each individual and that collective entity? So he's going to have a little different approach. He's not going to lay out as kind of conveniently as Locke did for us in neat kind of chronological sequence the steps that have to happen that produce civil society. Rousseau is going to sort of assume you're familiar with that sequence, and he's going to take a more topical approach in Book 1. Book 2 is going to focus on that thing that we create when we give over our rights, the community or umpire, or what Rousseau is going to call the general will or sovereign. And so Book 2 is focused on the umpire that we create when we surrender our natural conditions. And only then in Book 3 is Rousseau going to want us to consider the nature of government. And Book 3 is, in substance, a kind of primer on Aristotelian constitutional theory or classical constitutional science that we outlined back in Module 1. Both of these elements are important, as we'll come to see by the time we get to the end of Module 5. First, this three-part model, that there's two steps that get taken. First, we start in our natural state and we create this thing called the general will, step 1. And then after we create the general will, we then create government as a distinct and separate step, understanding that three-segment or two-transition model and how different that is from John Locke's model, where we're in the state of nature, we give our consent, and then we're in civil society. It's a kind of binary between nature and civil society. That distinction is fundamental to understanding Rousseau's model of the social contract. And so too is when he does get to talk about government, he's primarily going to be borrowing Aristotelian political theory, because the other great goal that Rousseau is engaged in here is how to reconcile classical constitutional science with 18th century social contract theory or theory of democratic revolution. We're going to follow both of those themes as we work our way through the text. So let's turn now to the introduction. Turning now to Chapter 1 and this iconic first paragraph of Rousseau's On Social Contract. You may be forgiven if you have the feeling that Rousseau is playing with you, that he must be sarcastic or satirical. He can't possibly mean what he writes here in the first paragraph. Man is born free, he says, and everywhere he is in chains. One thinks himself the master of others and still remains a greater slave than they. How did this change come about? I do not know. What can make it legitimate? That question I think I can answer. Taken literally, Rousseau is promising here to prove why it is legitimate that man is born free and he is currently in chains. And this might be a perfectly logical introduction to a work of political philosophy that was going to advocate totalitarianism or authoritarianism or absolute monarchy. But in fact, it's the opening paragraph of a work that's going to describe a radically egalitarian vision of civil society and promise a great liberation and freedom to the subjects of a system built on Rousseau's principles. Why is it then, if he's not simply poking fun at us and being a kind of Riddler, right? Why would he open his text with a promise to show us why it's legitimate that we are in chains? Unpacking this riddle, resolving this contradiction, is going to require us to adopt radically different conceptions of those core terms that we learned in Locke. A radically different idea about what freedom is, or equality is, or what sovereignty is, what rights are, what property is. We're going to have to understand those terms in very different ways to be able to understand what Rousseau means by the legitimacy of our chains. For indeed, what Rousseau is describing here as slavery or chains, he in fact means is freedom. And he is clearly signaling to us here in the opening sentences that this is not going to be an easy or a didactic text. It's going to be a text that we're going to have to unpack the layers of meaning. We can begin to unpack Rousseau's riddle by recognizing the dichotomy of conceptual categories that he presents to us in the second paragraph, and then recognizing that the topics in the chapters that follow are an elaboration upon this basic dichotomy. In the second paragraph there in the highlighted passage, Rousseau writes, "But the social order is a sacred right, which is the basis of all other rights. Nevertheless, this right does not come from nature and must therefore be founded on conventions." So if something comes from nature, it must not be a convention. If it doesn't come from nature, it must be a convention. Right? So there's a dichotomy here between nature and conventions. Now, what's a convention? He's going to give us an example at the beginning of chapter 2, the family. He writes, "The most ancient of all societies, and the only one that is natural, is the family. And even so, the children remain attached to the father only so long as they need him for their preservation. As soon as this need ceases, the natural bond is dissolved. The children, released from the obedience they owed to their father, and the father, released from the care he owed to his children, return equally to independence. If they remain united, they continue so no longer naturally, but voluntarily, and the family itself is then maintained only by convention." So things that are natural are compulsory. That is to say, we're driven by our inner nature to do those things, like the procreative urge to have children. Things that are based on convention are voluntary. They are, in other words, consensual, though Rousseau is loath to use that word. The family is a first example because it is both at the same, in sequence, that is to say, not at the same time. And also because it gives Rousseau a convenient metaphor to kind of stick his thumb in Locke's eye. If you look at the top of the right-hand column, the first paragraph, Rousseau writes, "The family then may be called the first model of political societies. The ruler corresponds to the father, and the people to the children, and all, being born free and equal, alienate their liberty only for their own advantage." So you can see, having just finished Locke's second treatise, and you will recall that in the very first chapter, Locke's fundamental assertion for the whole text is, whatever political authority is, it is unlike the rule of the father and the rule of the household. Well, here's Rousseau at the beginning of his text saying, no, the family is the perfect model of political society exactly because it is not based on natural subjugation, but instead, or natural subordination, but instead is based on consensual, conventional relationship. The inference here, of course, is that Rousseau is pointing out the absurdity of that division between household authority and political authority that was so foundational to Locke's presentation. For Rousseau's purposes in constructing his own model of the social contract, the family in this playing with the categories of convention and nature is a way of introducing the dynamic between force and free will, or coercion and consent. And it's that dynamic between power dynamic that's the central focus of these first several chapters. So we find him citing a bunch of famous philosophers in the next several paragraphs. Hopefully you recognize a few of these. Hobbes, hopefully you had some exposure to in Foundations, and Aristotle at the bottom. Caligula you might know by reputation. And Grotius is a 17th century natural law philosopher who essentially writes in defense of the absolute power of kings to rule, not that different than Hobbes. The summation here, though, comes in the highlighted passage at the bottom of the right-hand column. The reasoning of Caligula agrees with that of Hobbes and Grotius. Aristotle, before any of them, had said that men are by no means equal naturally, but that some are born for slavery and others for dominion. Again, implicit here is that this catalog of famous writers who all agree about natural inequality stand in juxtaposition to the unnamed Locke, who claims that men are naturally equal in opposition to this consensus of Western philosophy for 2,000 years. And Rousseau is interested in teasing out that contradiction between Locke's claim of natural equality or the foundational premise of democratic theory, which presumes human equality, in juxtaposition to the received wisdom of 2,000 years of Western philosophers who all seem to agree that men are unequal and that some are born for slavery and others to rule. So Rousseau doesn't want to dispute the reality, the existence of inequality, but he wants to think about the relationship between that reality and legitimacy, validity, justice. Just because it exists doesn't mean that it is just. So he writes in the concluding line here on page 2, Aristotle was right, but he took the effect for the cause. So slavery or inequality here is an opportunity for Rousseau to reflect on the relationship between violence, force, or power, and consent, morality, justice, free will. And that's the central focus here of chapter 3, he says in the first paragraph. The strongest is never strong enough to be always the master, unless he transforms strength into right and obedience into duty. Hence the right of the strongest, which, though to all seeming meant ironically, is really laid down as a fundamental principle. But are we never to have an explanation of this phrase? Force is a physical power, and I fail to see what moral effect it can have. To yield to force is an act of necessity, not of will, at the most an act of prudence. In what sense can it be a duty? And then if we look at the last paragraph of that short chapter 3, before we summarize, he says, let us admit that force does not create right, and that we are obliged to obey only legitimate powers. So we get finally in chapter 3 a set of conceptual or definitional traits that will help us sort out these two categories, nature versus convention. We've already seen that nature entails a biological compulsion, whereas conventions are based on voluntary consent, right? And here we see a couple of more definitional traits, that nature is based on force and physical power, whereas conventions have morality. That force and nature create an act of necessity, whereas conventions elicit an act of the will. And finally, that only conventions can confer duty or obligation to obey. So let's take a moment here to pause and summarize and think about the conceptual categories that Rousseau is giving us. So Rousseau has asked us to think about what kinds of men's chains can be legitimate. And he's introduced these dichotomous categories, nature versus conventions, and given us a series of definitional traits to associate with each of those conceptual categories. So nature is marked by compulsion, force, necessity, and conventions are marked by consent, free will, morality. Now, of these two categories, conventions appears the most sort of innately or intuitively commonsensical to American readers. That is to say, people who come from a political culture derived from the Lockean strain of the social contract tradition. It seems that what Rousseau means by conventions is roughly a synonym for what Locke meant by contract. Things to which we consent with our free will and that convey moral obligation to obey. We'll see as we turn to the next section in Rousseau's description of the social compact that indeed he means something quite different by consent and contract. But here in the introduction, we can readily grasp what he's trying to convey with this conceptual category. What he means by nature and compulsion, force, and necessity is a little more complicated. When Rousseau says that yielding to force is an act of necessity, not will, we can imagine a scenario in which we could be sympathetic to that statement. You can imagine, you've probably seen a movie with a storyline along the lines of an innocent, non-criminal person is compelled to commit a crime because they're being forced to by a dastardly villain, right? Maybe he grabs the family and is holding them hostage, and then the protagonist has to go off and commit some crime on their behalf, or the villain will destroy the family. You can imagine someone accused of a crime in a contemporary American court saying, I had to do it, I was forced to do it by some other, right? I didn't want to sell the drugs, but the drug boss was going to kill me if I didn't keep working for him. And that in an American court, a judge and a jury in American law will diminish the responsibility. That person is likely to get a lesser sentence if indeed they can prove that they were being forced to commit their behavior by another person. So we can readily imagine a scenario in which yielding to an act of force is not an act of free will. They put a gun to my head and told me to push the button launching a nuclear missile. I didn't choose to launch the nuclear missile. I was forced to by this other person. But notice that Rousseau's analysis is not limited to an exterior right of the strongest, a strongest external person compelling you to do something. Nature itself, your own biology, to the extent it compels you to do something, then invalidates the moral dimension of your choice. So he gives the example of the family, and he imagines that the impulse to procreate is compulsory. Our biology, our natural substance that makes us up as a species, compels us. We don't have a choice whether we want to procreate. Well, that too, then, is an act that lacks morality, that lacks free will. And that's a rather more difficult ethical proposition for American readers. Imagine the same person on the stand in a trial saying, I didn't want to steal, I didn't choose to steal, I was hungry, right? And because I was hungry, I went into the store and stole the food I need. You can imagine some people being sympathetic to that story, but it being very unlikely to diminish your legal culpability in American courtroom, right? But Rousseau here is asserting both of those things. Whether it's an outside force, a stronger person who sort of is making you choose between a criminal act in your life, or if it's your own internal nature compelling you to do a thing. Both of those are marks of nature. And so he wants to refute Locke's claim that political society is the result of the operation of natural law. He wants to distinguish political society as a thing that is made through human choice. It's an exercise of free will, and that's why it connotes a moral obligation. This analysis, or this reworking of Locke's formula of nature and society, then sets the foundation for Rousseau to denounce slavery in absolutist terms that are really radical for the 18th century. So let's turn now and look at Rousseau's critique of slavery. Returning to the text in chapter 4, then, we are anticipating in the subject of slavery to find a kind of ultimate or maximal expression of the opposition between force and will, necessity and morality, or nature and convention. Rousseau begins by picking up his argument with Grotius and whether kings rule in the manner of master over a slave, but he returns to these categories at the bottom of the left-hand column of page 4, the discussion of liberty and free will. He writes in the highlighted passage, "To renounce liberty is to renounce being a man, to surrender the rights of humanity and even its duties. For him who renounces everything, no indemnity is possible. Such a renunciation is incompatible with man's nature. To remove all liberty from his will is to remove all morality from his acts." If it is the freedom of our choice that creates our moral accountability, that is to say, our moral accountability is diminished to the extent that we don't have freedom of choice, and if the fundamental condition of slavery is that one has zero freedom of choice, that one is at the direction of their owner or master, then the slave can have no moral obligation to the master, not even an obligation to obey. Understanding that basic moral proposition is, of course, why Locke concludes his contradictory explanation of slavery with the seemingly incoherent claim that the slave, the moment the slave consents to being a slave, he ceases to be a slave. And so he proposes that an individual can agree to the condition of renouncing their will. Rousseau thinks that that is illogical and absurd. He continues, "Finally, it is an empty and contradictory convention." Again, Rousseau is using that word convention the way Locke uses the word contract. It is an empty and contradictory convention that sets up on one side absolute authority and on the other unlimited obedience. Is it not clear that we can be under no obligation to a person from whom we have the right to exact everything? Does not this condition alone, in the absence of equivalence or exchange, in itself involve the nullity of the act? For what right can my slave have against me, when all that he has belongs to me, and his right being mine, this right of mine against myself is a phrase devoid of meaning? It is absurd and illogical, Rousseau is saying, to assume that someone can consent to give over their power of consent. Right? If you engage in the act of consent, then you're showing that you have the capacity to consent. It's not something you can vacate from yourself. If someone were to take it from you, right, that is possible. But if so, then they also take with you your moral accountability. Is the slave morally accountable for stealing a chicken from the hen house at night, right? Certainly if the slave gets caught, he's going to get whipped and punished for stealing. But the question is that merely an act of violence? Or does the slave have a moral responsibility to obey the conditions of their servitude? Now, of course, we as modern 21st century readers can have a simple answer to that question, right? It is not a difficult moral question for us a century and a half after the end of slavery to say, well, of course the slave can steal the chicken from the hen house if they can get away without getting caught. Screw the master, right? The slave can get away with whatever they want to. If it were me, I would kill the master, right? That's a very modern way, moral way of assessing that relationship. But you can imagine if you lived in a slave society, it would be very difficult to hold that position, and the impulse would be strong to think that the slave is responsible, the slave should obey the rules of being a slave. As illogical as that sounds, it would be really hard to maintain social order in a slave society without that basic proposition. And indeed, in the history of the American South and other slave systems, you see exactly that kind of dilemma come up in all kinds of practical, real-world situations. Rousseau's denunciation of that proposition here, his pointing out the blatant absurdity, what we moderns can agree with Rousseau and sympathize with his critique here. It's simply illogical to imagine that someone could agree to be a slave. It's contrary to our nature as human beings. It's contrary to our species to give over our free will to make decisions for ourselves. That could only be the result of external force compelling us to give over our free choice. In that critique, Rousseau is startlingly and radically modern, writing this in the 1750s when there are just very few critiques available in the Western world of slavery as an institution. And you saw how twisted Locke became in trying to reconcile his claims of natural liberty with the existence of slavery, and how impulsive he seemed to be to rationalize slavery and say that it could be okay, even though it clearly contradicts his primary claims of his philosophy. And we can see how clearly Rousseau is thinking about Locke in that the next part of the argument directly takes on Locke's argument of the war captive theory, here identified with the writings of Grotius. Rousseau writes at the top of the right-hand column of 4, Grotius and the rest find in war another origin for the so-called right of slavery, the victor having, as they hold, the right of killing the vanquished. The latter can buy back his life at the price of his liberty, and this convention is the more legitimate because it is to the advantage of both parties. This is, in succinct summary, Locke's argument for the war captive, here identified with the writings of Grotius, and there were other writers of the 17th century who made the same argument. But none, again, who are associated, like Locke, with a theory of democratic egalitarianism. Grotius is a philosopher who is writing in defense of the absolute power of kings. But Rousseau is going to deny the analogy between states of war among states, that is, armies and soldiers under the command of generals, and the conflict between men in nature. He's going to argue that that is not a state of war, that is something different. In the next paragraph, he writes, men, from the mere fact that while they're living in their primitive independence, they have no mutual relations stable enough to constitute either the state of peace or the state of war, cannot be naturally enemies. The war of man with man can exist neither in the state of nature, where there is no constant property, nor in the social state, where everything is under the authority of the laws. Now we'll come shortly to Rousseau's portrait of the state of nature, which is very, very different than Locke's. But the underlying point here is that war is something that states engage in, and to the extent that they enlist individual citizens to act as the agents of that war, that does not implicate the soldiers as being enemies to each other. He writes in the skip a paragraph and the final highlighted passage, war then is a relation not between man and man, but between state and state. And individuals are enemies only accidentally, not as men, nor even as citizens, but as soldiers. So neither the argument that slaves can agree to be slaves, nor the argument that slaves are sort of just captives taken and put to use and to their advantage because they're not being killed. Denying both of those arguments, then, Rousseau summarizes at the end of chapter 4, so from whatever aspect we regard the question, the right of slavery is null and void, not only as being illegitimate, but also because it is absurd and meaningless. The words slave and right contradict each other and are mutually exclusive. It will always be equally foolish for a man to say to a man or to a people, I make with you a convention wholly at your expense and wholly to my advantage. I shall keep it as long as I like, and you will keep it as long as I like. So there can be no convention that establishes slavery. Slavery does exist, so slavery must then be a product of nature, right? He's not denying the existence of slavery. He's denying that it can ever be right or just or legitimate or valid. And it's this theme in Rousseau's text here, far more than ever being an advocate for sort of radical democracy, direct democracy, the rule of the people. It is his radical egalitarianism, that he takes the principle of natural equality seriously in a way that the writers preceding him did not, and that he seeks to reconcile that basic contradiction, right, in social contract theory as it had emerged in its first three-quarters of a century, that most marked off Rousseau as a dangerous, radical writer, right, a democratic and egalitarian writer. The actual structure of Rousseau's model for the social contract, then, these first 4 chapters are essentially the introduction, laying out these 2 categories, force versus will, compulsion versus morality, or necessity versus morality, and nature versus convention. Starting with chapter 5 now, we start with Rousseau building his model of what the social contract